The air crackles with ozone, a low thrum from the power substation's recycled guts. Dust motes dance in the harsh glow of the single neon tube, an angry red slash across the scarred metal console. Outside, the city breathes, a rhythmic sigh, a 1966 echo in a 2036 skull.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Across New York, the dial sits at 66 Fahrenheit under clear. Winds are moving from the north-northeast at 8 miles per hour. Good evening, architects of tomorrow. Tonight, we're calibrating our internal compass, focusing on the sovereign architect framing, building from a place where self-worth is structural, not borrowed. This week, the news cycle throws a sharp spotlight on systems under stress, demanding we discern architectural signal from the toxic residue of compromised frameworks. Our first vector, the unsettling reality of global migration, where nations play a shell game with human lives. The US is reportedly using both cash and coercion to offload migrants onto African soil.
That's right, Togee. Show the US government is actively negotiating agreements, like those with Rwanda, Mauritania, and Niger, to accept migrants, many of whom are from Latin America and the Caribbean, who have no familial, cultural, or historical connection to the continent. These deals often involve millions in aid, with thinly veiled threats of reduced assistance or sanctions if countries don't comply. This effectively creates a legal black hole for these deportees, who are held without charges, often indefinitely, in unfamiliar countries, where they have few if any rights and no support networks.
This echoes ancient colonial patterns, where distant powers dictate the fate of people in territories far from their borders. We're seeing a modern scramble for Africa for human bodies, with migrants treated as fungible cargo rather than individuals with provenance. The image is stark, a digital manifest replacing a shared ancestry, dumping people where they are merely numbers, stripped of their stories and their agency. It's a profound disrespect for individual dignity.
The who is affected here is multifaceted. Firstly, the migrants themselves, trapped in a stateless limbo, denied due process, and facing unimaginable hardship and uncertainty. Secondly, the African nations, coerced into these agreements, are forced to trade humanitarian obligation for economic leverage, straining their own already limited resources and potentially destabilizing their internal social structures. Finally, the integrity of international asylum law is undermined, as the U.S. effectively externalizes its legal and moral responsibilities.
The current next move for the U.S. is clear. Continue to externalize its migration challenges, outsourcing moral responsibility to less resourced nations with a checkbook. This tactic, while politically expedient in the short term, fundamentally avoids addressing the root causes of migration and the ethical implications of its own policies. It treats human beings as a problem to be moved, not individuals deserving of dignity.
A viable alternative would be to reallocate those millions currently spent on these externalization deals. Instead, invest them into robust, in-region processing centers in Latin America, focusing on fair and efficient asylum claims and establishing safe, legal transit pathways. This would also involve expanding existing legal migration routes to the U.S. itself, rather than creating new offshore holding zones that violate fundamental human rights. Such a move would recenter consent and provenance in migration policy, acknowledging human dignity as a structural imperative.
Externalizing human dignity is never a sustainable architecture. The cost is always borne by the most vulnerable, and it corrodes the foundational ethics of all involved. Now let's shift our gaze to an internal collapse, as Cuba once again grapples with systemic failure. Somewhere a capacitor creaks under the load, hot metal. The console keeps its lights and its secrets. Cuba has just suffered its third nationwide blackout in 6 months, leaving millions in the dark. This isn't just an inconvenience, it's a structural tremor in the heart of a nation.
Indeed. The concrete facts are brutal. A complete grid collapse across all 15 provinces, triggered by faults at key thermal power plants like Antonio Guterres in Matanzas, which had only just come back online. This plunges approximately 11 million citizens into agony, as one resident described it, disrupting everything from hospitals and essential services to food preservation and clean water access. The aging and fragile energy infrastructure, combined with severe fuel shortages, exacerbated by decades of the U.S. embargo, means the system is perpetually on the brink.
This isn't just a technical failure, it's a cultural trauma. Imagine the constant hum of uncertainty, a modern society repeatedly forced back to candle and hand fan, to a pre-industrial rhythm. This repeated darkness erodes trust, severing the foundational connection between citizens and the state's promise of stability. It's like a vital artery that keeps clotting, affecting the very heartbeat of daily life for generations, fostering a pervasive sense of helplessness and frustration.
The who is affected is primarily the Cuban people, struggling with basic survival, health, and economic stability. Businesses are crippled, education is disrupted, and the psychological toll of constant uncertainty is immense. The Cuban government also faces mounting pressure over its failing energy infrastructure and its inability to secure consistent fuel supplies, leading to a crisis of legitimacy and increasing social unrest. The embargo, while often cited, doesn't absolve the need for internal architectural resilience.
The current next move is reactive, temporary repairs, hoping for inconsistent fuel shipments, and perpetuating a fragile, centralized system that remains vulnerable to single points of failure. This approach merely patches over the symptoms without addressing the deep-seated structural issues of an outdated grid and external dependencies. It's a cycle of crisis management rather than proactive architecture.
A more resilient and dignified viable alternative would be a massive, internationally supported push for decentralized solar microgrids across communities, combined with a targeted easing of the U.S. embargo specifically for energy infrastructure components and renewable technology. This would empower local energy autonomy, reduce vulnerability to single-point failures, and assert energy provenance directly at the community level, giving citizens more control over their power supply and building a truly resilient national architecture.
When foundational systems crumble, the internal compass guides us toward decentralized resilience. From physical grids to digital networks, the need for robust architecture that favors consent and provenance is paramount. Same dossier, new angle, keep the thread tight.
This was a stark reminder of our digital fragility. The concrete facts are that a major cloud provider, name withheld for now, reported a software glitch within its core routing protocols. This cascaded into widespread outages for internet service providers, banking platforms, transportation scheduling, and even critical emergency services like 000 calls across several continents for nearly 8 hours. Millions of users and businesses were left without connectivity, with estimated economic losses running into hundreds of millions of dollars globally.
This event highlights our collective vulnerability to a single point of digital failure. It's like the ancient myth of the world tree Yggdrasil, suddenly developing a crack at its root, threatening the stability of all realms. This isn't just about losing connection. It's about losing the tools of commerce, communication, and even life-saving emergency services, all because one unseen proprietary system faltered. It erodes our trust in the invisible architecture that underpins modern life.
The who is affected ranges from individual users unable to access essential services, pay for groceries, or call for help, to multinational corporations whose operations ground to a halt, leading to significant financial losses and reputational damage. Beyond the economic impact, there's a profound loss of trust in the digital commons, and a stark revelation of how dependent our civic infrastructure has become on a handful of privately owned, opaque systems. Our consent to this centralized fragility is often unexamined.
The current next move by the industry is typically an internal review, a software patch, and a public apology, hoping to rebuild trust in the same centralized model. This reactive approach fails to address the fundamental architectural problem, the dangerous concentration of power and single points of failure within critical global infrastructure. It's an incremental fix to a systemic vulnerability.
A more structurally sound and dignified viable alternative would involve mandatory industry standards for multi-cloud redundancy and the implementation of truly distributed ledger technologies for critical public infrastructure. Imagine a civic architecture built on open-source, independently verifiable code, where no single glitch in a proprietary system can take down the entire global nervous system. This would reclaim digital provenance, ensuring transparency and resilience through decentralized control.
The integrity of our digital commons is as vital as our physical ones. We must question the concentration of power that allows a single glitch to disrupt entire societies. Patching in a caller, the skeptic. You're on the signal.
With all due respect, these alternatives you're proposing, decentralized microgrids, open-source civic architecture, local migrant processing, they sound utopian. Who actually funds these massive shifts? Who guarantees security for distributed systems? You're talking about tearing down existing structures to build new ones, but isn't that just creating new vulnerabilities and costing astronomical sums? Where's the practical logic in that?
That's a critical challenge, skeptic. The question of resources and security is always structural. But consider the current investment in systems that fail at scale, costing hundreds of millions in outages or displacing populations with punitive policies. Shifting that investment towards resilient, distributed architectures isn't just an emotional imperative for dignity, it's a logical recalibration of risk and a long-term economic imperative.
On funding, look to historical parallels. The initial capital for railroads or early internet infrastructure wasn't conjured from thin air. It was a societal choice, a recognition of long-term value. A decentralized energy grid or an open-source digital commons would attract investment from communities, impact investors, and even progressive governments recognizing the long-term cost savings in resilience. It's about reprioritizing where our collective wealth builds value and sovereignty.
And on security, centralized systems, by their nature, present a single, high-value target for attack, making them inherently vulnerable. Distributed systems, while complex in design, fundamentally resist single points of failure, making them more resilient against both technical glitches and malicious attacks. It's not about tearing down everything. It's about strategically re-architecting critical components to favor consent, provenance, and dignity over convenience and concentrated power. We're not building a highway, but a resilient web of independent pathways.
Exactly. It's about integrating logic, the practicalities of resource allocation and security, with the emotional imperative for dignity and provenance. It's not just a technological solution, it's a reassertion of communal sovereignty, turning confusion about who owns our data, who powers our lives, or who is responsible for human displacement into actionable vectors for building stronger, more ethical architectures.
Play the next move.
Black Star Pirate Radio.
Continue the signal at TogeeVision.com. Tune in, Sparks and Stories, Gig Passport.